Welcome to our one-on-one discussion with the major candidates to be the next mayor of Boston. My name is Jim Rooney. I'm president and CEO of the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber is the region's leading business voice, representing 1,300 businesses who collectively employ hundreds of thousands of people in and around Boston. Candidates are participating in many forums around the city, and in this conversation, we want to focus on the issues that are priorities for the business community of Boston and the big and small employers who drive economic success by creating and sustaining jobs. For many years now, Boston has enjoyed tremendous growth. The city attracts young talent, incubates life-changing innovations, and supports new development. We punch above our weight, so to speak, accounting for 2.2% of national GDP, even though we have just 1.5% of the population. The next mayor has the challenge of growing and maintaining this success in a changed world. We've seen in the last year that a city's economic vibrancy and success is fragile, and across the US, both businesses and people are relocating. Oftentimes, relocations are driven by the costs of living and working, regulation and taxation, issues of public safety, and failures of local and state governments to meet the needs of its key industries and businesses. The risks are acute for Boston because we rely mightily on talent and employers that are mobile. In our next mayor, the business community seeks a partner who is willing to work side by side to compete in the global and mobile economy. Today's discussion is one way to learn about how candidates will do that. The candidates also completed a questionnaire we developed, and responses are posted on our website. The candidate field will be narrowed to 2 finalists in a citywide primary election on Tuesday, September 14th. The Chamber hopes all Bostonians will engage in this election by learning about the candidates and exercising their right and privilege to vote on Election Day. Our purpose at the Greater Boston Chamber is to make Boston the best place for all businesses and all people to succeed. So let's have a conversation about how we can do that together. I'm pleased to introduce Councilor Andrea Campbell. Andrea Campbell is a Boston City Councilor representing District 4 and is focused on closing generational inequities in our city. Andrea served as Deputy Legal Counsel in Governor Deval Patrick's administration and was the first Black woman to serve as Boston City Council President. Andrea, welcome.
Thank you, Jim, for having me. And of course, thank you to your members and all the work that you do.
So there's a lot we'd like to cover, so we'd ask you to keep your answers succinct, but let's get started. First, why are you running for mayor?
I jumped into the mayor's race back in September and really looking, frankly, at the moment in time we're in, where we're talking about, of course, COVID-19 devastating not only the country and the world, but also our city, but having a disproportionate impact on communities of color. The painful murder of George Floyd, and I've been stressing that that affected everyone, not just low-income residents or people of color, all of us. And I think against that backdrop, Boston has a unique opportunity to not only continue, of course, to be a world-class city, which we will continue to be, but to really finally address our painful history when it comes to division and racism, but to do the hard work of eradicating the persistent health inequities and educational inequities and housing inequities in every system you can imagine, because that holds us back from being truly the #1 and best city for every resident in the city of Boston. So I jumped into the race to say, if we want to do that here in this city, we need leadership that is not only bold and courageous, and I am both of those things, and I have a record of accomplishment that speaks to that, but leadership that has lived those very inequities, and I have lived every inequity you could possibly think of, but also leadership that has a record of accomplishment on getting things done, and also a vision of making sure that going forward, we address the hard issues as a collective. And that's just what my leadership has been. And so I said I was done standing on the sidelines waiting for someone else to do it. And now I'm in this race, sharing, of course, my personal story and my record of accomplishment on all of those issues, and excited for my candidacy.
Andrea, shifting to one of the biggest challenges facing the new mayor, and you mentioned it, tackling equity and economic inclusion. Issues of racism, inequality, the gaps in our society have appropriately been elevated in the public discourse. And you talked about the role of government, but what's the business community's role in creating a more equitable Boston?
It's substantial and it's necessary. The best thing about the city of Boston is that we do have a robust business community. Large employers, of course, across every industry you can think of, and emerging industries that are inventing vaccines. So clearly we are at the forefront when it comes to a robust economic business community. I often talk about my personal story in that, I grew up in the city of Boston. I'm a BPS kid, and I left Latin school and went to Princeton University and then UCLA for law school. And by all metrics, my life has been a total success. My twin brother, on the other hand, died 9 years ago while in the custody of a state prison when he was only 29 years old. And we both grew up poor in the city of Boston, tremendous instability in our childhood. But yet this is the city that allowed me to be successful. So I think it really demonstrates, on the one hand, we are a world-class city, but on the other hand, we do have inequities we have to grapple with. The business community, I think, has been at the forefront of ensuring that these inequities are addressed, and has a unique opportunity and role to play. Right now, we're talking about workforce development opportunities in the city of Boston. We're going to need greater investments there when you think about the number of folks who are still unemployed. Of course, when we talk about what does it mean to make sure we have a skilled, local, talented workforce that I know is important to the business community, that means investing in and working in partnership with working in partnership with our city government to improve our Boston public schools, including Madison Park, and establishing a VOTEC pathways in Boston public schools. The business community plays a substantial role, must, in helping us ensure that every family has access to affordable childcare, dealing with transportation issues, housing affordability, and I know the business community wants to play a substantial role there, and climate, of course. But the last piece I have to stress, in all of my conversations with business leaders in the city of Boston, everyone has said we want to be more embedded and more of a partner to the city of Boston in tackling all of the inequities across every system you can imagine. So I think this is an opportunity for the city of Boston and City Hall to maximize those partnerships with this incredible, robust industry that we have in the city of Boston.
I want to move on to real estate development, which, as you know, at times can be controversial, but it's an important part of our growth. What's your view of the city's development review process? Does it need to be streamlined? We've heard that word used during the campaign. And what does streamline mean?
It absolutely does. We talk about the number one issue right now in the city of Boston, and I've heard this not only from various surveys that have been done, particularly of voters and employers, is housing affordability and how expensive it is to live in the city of Boston. Every one of us has a role to play in changing that. What I've also heard is, while we can, of course, push the city of Boston to be creative, I started the vacant lot initiative, activating city-owned vacant lots for housing purposes and pushing for more streams of revenue to create more affordable housing. I've also heard at the same time, it takes too long to build in the city of Boston. A recent builder told me it's easier to build affordable housing in New York City than it is in the city of Boston, which is absolutely ridiculous. Mm-hmm. And so streamlining processes means, for me, looking at, for example, the Article 80 process and removing affordable housing projects out of that process as a way to speed up the development of affordable housing without, of course, taking out community voice, but speeding it up in one way to streamline process and allow housing to be built quicker. So it's less time consuming and less expensive, which of course is good for everybody. Also looking at ISD. We often talk about the BPDA and certain and the zoning board, but ISD and other departments in the city play a major role. Many of these agencies are understaffed. Many of these agencies don't have staff that have the breadth of expertise that they would need with respect to doing projects of a certain magnitude. The BPDA, for example, doesn't have anyone on the team who has a deep understanding of financing and how difficult it is to finance affordable housing projects. So diversifying our staff, expanding our staff to have more human capital while cutting the red tape and bureaucracy, I think will absolutely allow us to build more affordable housing quicker in the city of Boston, save costs, and address this crisis.
Andrea, staying on the development theme, the Seaport district's been criticized by all the candidates and others. What do you think is wrong with the way the development unfolded in the Seaport? What would you have done differently, or will you do differently going forward?
First, I'll take a step back. When I grew up in the city, the Seaport didn't exist. And Fenway actually didn't look like the way it did now. And frankly, the Seaport, we were told not to go down because there was nothing down there. But when you think about, we built a brand new neighborhood in the city of Boston that is probably one of the least diverse, the most expensive to live in, and has a very small percentage of businesses owned and run by women and people of color. That's a problem. And I think it's a problem that is indicative of the larger narrative of the city of Boston that I think we all want to change, right? Boston has a reputation of being the most racist city in the country. Boston, for some, that is not a perception, that is a reality. And I firmly and deeply love the city of Boston and know that we can change that. But it really does require intentionality. I know that there are folks, of course, working extremely hard to ensure that more people of color, more BIPOC entrepreneurs and businesses have access to capital and technical assistance to be able to open up in the Seaport. I know that work is ongoing, and I've been pushing to say, let's do it swiftly and quickly. But it really starts with planning. Right now in the city of Boston, we have the 2030 plan started by our previous mayor. There's some good stuff in there, but we need to do a little bit more planning. What does every neighborhood need? Not just in terms of housing, but in terms of business infrastructure, economic development. There are some neighborhoods that don't have access to good parks, good transit. We need to change all that, but we can't change it if we don't have a deep sense of what a community needs. And once we know that, of course, informed by the residents who live there, we then push the city of Boston to build in response. And I think that planning is going to be critically important going forward. But the second tier that I think is important is not just having a sense of what every neighborhood needs, but also this larger overlay that the city of Boston must do. When we talk about climate and resiliency, the neighborhood may say, we want to build close to the water. The city of Boston might have to say, that's not a good idea when you think about flooding and issues of climate going forward. So we always have to sort of keep in mind, how do we make our city more resilient, more inclusive, and more accessible, so that every neighborhood, as they're building and developing their plans, align with this larger vision of creating a more equitable, a more inclusive, accessible, and climate resilient city in the city of Boston.
Andrea, let's talk about education. The business community cares deeply about education because today's students are tomorrow's workforce. During the pandemic, one of the issues that was highlighted was the poor condition of schools in Boston in need of significant capital investment. Before spending hundreds of millions of dollars that perhaps we don't even have to spend, do we have too many school buildings? The report released in 2015 revealed that BPS should actually consolidate schools. As mayor, how would you address that issue?
We absolutely have to address the fact that we have declining enrollment. We actually just lost 2,000 families, which I think is the sharpest decline in the last 15 years. And frankly, I think that is absolutely depressing, because what it tells me is that families are really fed up, I think, with Boston Public Schools not delivering an excellent education for their child. And so if we're going to change that, we're going to have to, of course, address the fact that we do have too many buildings. And I think some of that consolidation has already happened under our current superintendent in the way we're reconfiguring grade levels. But I think that we need to think more comprehensively. One, we should make sure, of course, every single building that our children and educators go into is safe and is clean and doesn't have, say, asbestos in it. I have some buildings in my district that actually still have asbestos. So I think with this infusion of federal dollars, this is an opportunity for us to make those investments. I have been saying for months, even when our former mayor, Marty Walsh, was still here, that we should be accelerating some of these school projects because interest rates were low. And we should be using a substantial amount of the federal dollars that are coming in for these infrastructure projects, so every child has a safe building to attend school in, and every educator also feels safe. But the second piece that's critically important is, I put out a report 3 years ago, before I was a candidate for mayor, on ways in which to close the inequities within our Boston Public Schools. My record of accomplishment on really pushing for the approval, or I should say the improvement of Boston Public Schools stands out compared to every other candidate in this race. And I'm passionate about it because I went to 5 excellent Boston public schools. And I often say, but for the grace of God and the education I got in those schools, I would not have made it to a Princeton University. I would not have been successful. So I know what's possible. And so this plan I put out 3 years ago, I would simply implement immediately if blessed to become the next elected mayor. And it includes greater investments in universal pre-K and childcare, and starting an initiative from birth to 5, where every family has access. We can do that working in partnership with our employers and the business community. Redesigning our high schools, so we are creating pathways and developing young people who have the skill sets to go into the jobs now, particularly in tech, the trades, life sciences, biotech, you name it, but also the jobs of the future. And right now we've been talking about Madison Park for years. We need more than one Madison Park. We need a vo-tech system within Boston Public Schools, where Madison Park is frankly the center of that hub. And we need greater investment in these pathways, along with access to internships and opportunities for our students to gain certifications and credits from local colleges while still at BPS. So they can leave BPS and actually go into some of these jobs without necessarily having to even go to college and incur debt. And I know the business community cares deeply about that, as do I.
Right. In my opening remarks, I noted that some relocation of businesses and people occurs because of public safety. Movements to defund the police have swept across America. What does that phrase mean to you? And would you cut funding in the Boston Police Department budget in 2023 if elected?
My plan, which is the most thank you. I got you, Jim. You cut out for a minute, but I got you.
We're back.
We're back. My plan is the most comprehensive plan of any candidate in this race. And it's very specific. And I wanted to provide specifics because I wanted folks to know that when I put forth plans and ideas, I want folks to know that they're practical and they can happen. My goal is to transform our city's response to public safety. So it's not just, of course, pushing for a reduction in crime and then sort of, just for a temporary period of time. It's really driving at how do we eradicate violence in the city of Boston? And to do that, it's twofold. One, my plan says, yes, we absolutely can make sure every single community and neighborhood is safe and has an adequate number of officers to respond to the incidents of crime or calls that they get within a certain district. And to make that happen, I'm pushing our department to restructure certain specialized units to send them back to the districts so that there are a number of adequate officers to respond to calls they get. And why is that important and necessary? The police budget is absolutely not sustainable. And the police department itself has said the same. It's a $400 million budget with a $70 million overtime budget that keeps going up. And coming out of COVID, we're going to have to be responsible in our financing. So we're going to have to restructure our department. We can do that while ensuring adequate coverage and reining in an unsustainable budget. And then what do we do with those savings that we see? We not only reduce that overtime budget line item, we can redirect those dollars to the root causes of violence. We don't need another report from the Department of Justice to say that's just as important in order to reduce violence and to eventually eradicate it. And so I would invest those dollars in moving people out of poverty, in jobs and opportunity, of course, as well as mental health, which we do not invest enough resources in, substance use disorder, and other things that we're seeing in the city of Boston. And this is all possible. My plan has been vetted by officers who are currently in the department, retired officers, as well as folks in the community.
Talent is viewed by the business community as our competitive advantage. As mayor, how can we do a better job attracting and retaining talent for the city of Boston?
I'll start with attracting. We hear the biggest reasons why folks don't necessarily come to the city of Boston is it's too expensive to live here. So addressing issues of housing affordability is critical. Addressing that reputation of being the most racist city in the country. There are a lot of folks who want to come here and bring their talent. And so it really does require us coming together to change that narrative. And I think this investment we're seeing in tourism and this new campaign around a more all-inclusive city is driving at a narrative that we want to continue to promote. not just, of course, around the country, but in the world as a way to attract folks here. We obviously need to continue to invest in this ecosystem. We have the best hired institutions in the world. So folks are obviously going to continue to come here as we invest in our ecosystem here in the city of Boston. But how do we, of course, yes, keep them? Yes, it's changing the narrative of the city. It's making it more welcoming. And I'm just going to be frank, it's also making it, of course, more welcoming for students who are graduating, who are students of color. And I remember being a part of I'm a lawyer by training, the Mass Black Lawyer Association, many associations that are doing that work of creating entrepreneurial networking spaces for folks to go to. We have a lot of networks in the city of Boston, a lot of tables where you have folks from various industries and in the business community learning from each other, growing talent, mentoring talent. How do we open up these spaces to be more inclusive? To allow folks who want to become entrepreneurs, of course, who want to not only start a job here, but grow in their career. We know to do that, you have to network, you have to meet people, you have to have folks who believe in you. And in the city of Boston, we're going to have to open up these networking spaces to be more inclusive as a way to say, yes, we want you to stay here. We want you to keep your talent here. We want to invest in your talent as well. And I find myself sometimes still in rooms with folks that just look like you, Jim. And we can change that in the city of Boston. And I think there's an appetite to do that right now in the business community, working in partnership with the city of Boston.
Well, our time has gone by way too quickly. Andrea, what's your closing message to the business community of Boston? What can business leaders expect from a Campbell administration?
One, administration that always looks to work in partnership. I mean, is always honest and leads with integrity. So I have always led in such a way that I'm honest about the scope and magnitude of the problem. And I think that candidness resonates with folks in the business community. I don't hide and say that, Boston Public Schools is just okay. I always say there's room and ways to do better. I've also stressed that in order for the city of Boston to recover from COVID and to bounce back quickly from the economic devastation we've seen in certain parts of the city, the business community is going to have to play a vital role. And I will continue to partner with the business community, not only on traditional issues like workforce development, ensuring that we're working with Boston Public Schools to produce skilled workers, but also on issues of housing affordability, climate, and so many other issues, transportation, that I know the employers and the business community cares about. And you can always expect not only a partner who comes to you at the end, but at the beginning, where we're talking about what is the problem, what are the plans, and how do we develop those plans in partnership to respond to that problem? How do we all work together with timelines, accountability metrics, holding each other accountable to the issues that we have to grapple with going forward? So collaboration, collaborative leadership style, and partnership has always been the way I've led, and that won't change going forward.
Andrea, Campbell, thank you for your time today and for this discussion. And we wish you all the best going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. And of course, thank you to all you do and your team as well.